Welcome, dear friends, to Family Shadows. This is the place where stories of love, sacrifice, betrayal, and quiet justice come alive. Stories that remind us of the strength hidden in silence and the dignity carried by those who are often overlooked. If you believe in family, if you've ever felt unseen yet held on to your worth, then this channel is for you. We invite you to stay with us until the end, and if these stories move you, don't forget to subscribe to Family Shadows. By subscribing, you help us keep telling the stories that matter, the stories of fathers, of families, of respect lost and respect regained. Today's story begins with a title that will stay with you long after the last word. My son-in-law poured me wine but ordered me to wash dishes, so I walked away. Let us begin. Ellis Turner had been to many dinners in his life. He had sat at rough-hewn wooden tables in cabins with sawdust still in his hair from a long day as a carpenter. He had eaten off chipped plates with his late wife, Margaret, who never cared about fine china but always insisted on setting the table with a candle, even if the meal was just leftover stew. He had dined at church potlucks, where paper plates buckled under the weight of casseroles and pies and no one left hungry. But nothing quite prepared him for this dinner. The house belonged to his daughter, Natalie, and her husband, Colin Barnes. It was a suburban home, 2 stories of carefully painted beige with trimmed hedges and a driveway that gleamed with a new SUV. Everything about it was polished, as if each corner of the house had to prove something to the neighbors. Ellis had been invited, or perhaps expected, to come over that evening. Natalie had called 2 days earlier. Dad, Colin's hosting a dinner for some of his colleagues. We'd love to have you here. It'll mean a lot. He knew the tone. It wasn't exactly an invitation. It was the kind of request you couldn't refuse without sounding difficult. And Ellis Turner, 63 years old, widower, father of one, grandfather of none, was not a difficult man. He had spent his life being agreeable. Hard work, quiet dinners, evenings spent sanding wood in his shop, those had been his rhythm. Since Margaret passed, his rhythms had been quieter, lonelier, so he said yes. When he arrived, the house was already buzzing. Laughter spilled from the open windows. Inside, the dining table was set as though for a catalog photo. White plates, polished silverware, stemmed glasses catching the chandelier light. A bottle of red wine stood at the center, unopened. Natalie greeted him at the door with a smile that was warm but tight, as though stretched between 2 poles of loyalty. She hugged him quickly. "I'm glad you came, Dad," she whispered. Then Colin appeared, always well-dressed, always carrying himself like a man slightly above the room he occupied. He extended a hand to Ellis, firm, rehearsed. "Ellis," he said, almost as if Ellis were a client. "Good to see you. Come in, have a seat." Ellis nodded, following him to the table. He sat at the far end, not at the head, not quite at the side, a place that seemed chosen for him rather than chosen by him. The conversation swirled. Colin's colleagues, men in suits, women with sharp voices and sharper eyes, talked about markets and numbers, promotions and real estate deals. Ellis tried to follow, but it was like eavesdropping on another world. His world had been one of lumberyards, measuring tape, and the satisfaction of building something that stood steady under its own weight. He sipped water, listened, smiled politely. Then it happened. The wine was finally opened. Colin himself uncorked the bottle with a flourish, as though he were on stage. He walked around, pouring glasses for his guests, saving Ellis for last. When he reached the old man, he leaned slightly, filled Ellis's glass, and with a smile that didn't quite touch his eyes, said loud enough for everyone at the table, "Enjoy this, Ellis, and after you're done, you can help us out by washing the dishes, all right?" The words dropped like stones into the silence. For a split second, no one moved. Then a few chuckles rippled down the table. Not the hearty laughs of shared humor, but the uneasy, sharp-edged laughter of people who knew they should laugh because the host had made a joke. Ellis felt the heat rise in his face. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted the glass, not to drink but to steady himself. He looked at Colin, his son-in-law, the man who had promised to cherish his daughter, and saw not kindness, not respect, but smugness. A young man's confidence built not on wisdom but on the thrill of dominance. Natalie glanced at her father. For a moment her eyes softened, almost pleading, but she said nothing. She looked down at her plate, rearranged her food, let the moment pass. Ellis Turner sat there, 63 years of life behind him, and for the first time in a long time he felt like a boy again, small, invisible, asked to prove his worth in someone else's home. The wine tasted bitter, though it was probably sweet. The conversations resumed, louder than before, as though to cover the awkwardness. Ellis listened to the clatter of forks and knives, the hum of voices, the laughter that seemed to grow sharper with each passing minute. He sat in silence. He remembered dinners with Margaret. She would never have let anyone, especially not a son-in-law, speak to him that way. She had a quiet fierceness, the kind that demanded respect without raising her voice. Even their daughter Natalie, as a child, had known better. But Margaret was gone, and with her went the invisible armor that had always shielded him. Ellis's hands were calloused, scarred from decades of carpentry. They rested on the table, motionless. To anyone else, they were just old hands, but to Ellis they carried the memory of every crib he had built, every chair repaired, every table sanded smooth for the sake of his family. Those hands had built Natalie's childhood home, the same one she had left behind when she married Colin. And now those hands were being assigned to dishes. It wasn't the task itself. Ellis had washed plenty of dishes in his life. He had never thought it beneath him. But it was the manner, the stage of it all. The way Colin turned a simple chore into a public decree. That was what burned. As the dinner dragged on, Ellis realized he had no appetite. The food might as well have been paper. His glass of wine sat untouched, the red liquid reflecting the chandelier light like blood. He looked around the table, strangers, people who did not know him, who would not remember him tomorrow. His daughter, caught between love and fear. His son-in-law, basking in the glow of attention. He thought about speaking, about clearing his throat, letting his voice tremble with the weight of years, and saying, "I built homes while you were learning to tie a tie. I raised the woman you married. I buried my wife with my own hands, and you will not make me small." But the words never came. Instead, Ellis set his glass down, slowly, deliberately. The sound of it touching the table was soft, almost drowned by the chatter, but to Ellis it was a drumbeat. He pushed his chair back. The legs scraped against the hardwood floor. A few heads turned. Colin looked at him with a raised brow, half-smile still painted on his face. Ellis did not meet his gaze. He stood, straightened his back, and walked away from the table. No words, no explanation, just the silence of a man reclaiming his dignity. Behind him the voices faltered. The laughter dipped. Forks hovered midair. The room, for a breath, seemed to pause. Ellis reached the door, opened it, and stepped into the cool night air. The sound of the door closing was louder than anything Colin had said that evening. And that was how Ellis Turner left the dinner, quietly, with no argument, no scene, no broken plates. Just silence. A silence that weighed more heavily on the people inside that house than any speech could have. For sometimes, The loudest sound a man can make is the sound of his absence. The night air clung cool against Ellis Turner's skin as he stepped down the porch steps, the low murmur of voices still lingering faintly from the dining room he had left behind. He moved slowly, not because his body demanded it, though his knees ached from years bent over planks of wood, but because each step was heavy with something unspoken. Silence was his companion now, the same silence that had filled his house since Margaret's passing. He walked to his car, an aging Chevy that bore the scent of pine shavings no matter how many times he vacuumed it. He paused before opening the door, resting both hands on the roof as if steadying himself against an invisible storm. The laughter he had heard at the table echoed in his memory, each chuckle striking sharper than the last. Ellis wasn't a man prone to anger. He was slow-burning, the kind who could endure years of small slights without snapping. But endurance, he realized, had its limits. Tonight, something in him had shifted, not in fire, but in embers that glowed hot beneath ash. Inside the house, Natalie sat frozen at the table. She had seen her father's eyes when he set down the wine glass. They had been tired but not defeated. They had carried the same look she remembered from her childhood, the one that meant he had made up his mind and no force could move him. She wanted to follow him, to rise from her chair and chase after him into the night, but Colin's hand landed on hers, pressing down with the weight of expectation. "He'll be fine," Colin murmured so only she could hear. "Don't make a scene." But Natalie knew her father. Fine was the last word to describe him. Ellis drove the familiar road home, headlights painting lines along the darkened asphalt. The town he lived in wasn't much, a cluster of old houses, a corner store, a church that had doubled as the community's heartbeat for decades. His own house, a modest one-story with peeling white paint and a sagging porch swing, came into view. It was nothing compared to Colin and Natalie's carefully curated home, but it was his. He sat in the car long after the engine had died, staring at the faint glow from his workshop out back. He had left the lamp on, as he often did, too forgetful to flick the switch after hours spent carving or sanding. The smell of cedar seemed to reach him even here. When he finally went inside, the house greeted him with the kind of quiet that was both comforting and cruel. The living room was unchanged. Margaret's rocking chair still in the corner, the bookshelf she had loved still sagging under the weight of too many novels, the afghan she had knitted draped over the couch. Ellis lowered himself into the chair opposite the empty rocker. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of the evening press down. His chest tightened, not just with shame, but with an ache that came from somewhere deeper. He had lived his life by certain rules. Work hard, treat people kindly, never raise your hand unless to help. But sitting at that table tonight, mocked into silence, he had wondered if those rules had left him defenseless. For the first time, Ellis questioned whether his quiet was a virtue or a weakness. Natalie, meanwhile, excused herself early from the table. She told Colin she wasn't feeling well, ignoring the disapproval that flickered across his face. In the bathroom, she gripped the sink, staring at her reflection. She saw her father's eyes in her own, brown flecked with gold, tired but enduring. Memories flooded her. She was 6, standing in the yard with a hammer too big for her hand, her father kneeling beside her as they built a birdhouse. "Hold it steady, Nat," he had said gently. "The nail only goes straight if your hand does too." She remembered being 16, angry at the world, slamming doors. Her father never shouted back. He waited, always waited until her anger cooled, then knocked softly to ask if she wanted pie. And now she had sat at a table while her husband belittled him, while strangers laughed at his expense. She had lowered her eyes instead of raising her voice. The shame she felt was no less than his. Back at his house, Ellis rose and shuffled to the kitchen. The sink was empty, but he filled it anyway, running the faucet until steam rose from the basin. He washed a single plate, then a glass, then a fork. Not because they were dirty, but because his hands needed something to do. Each stroke of the sponge felt like penance. Each clink of dish against porcelain was louder than it should have been. He thought of Colin's smirk, the way the man had made a chore into a humiliation. Ellis whispered aloud, though no one was there to hear. "I've washed dishes my whole life, but not like that, not like a servant in my own daughter's home." The words surprised him. They sounded foreign, too sharp to belong to the man he had been. When the sink was empty, Ellis turned off the faucet and leaned against the counter. The silence pressed in again, and he realized something. Tonight had planted a seed in him. A seed of resolve. It smoldered quietly now, but it would grow. Meanwhile, Natalie slipped into the guest bedroom while Colin entertained the rest of his colleagues. She texted her father, though she doubted he would see it tonight. "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have said something. Please don't be hurt. I love you." The message hung there unsent for a moment, her thumb hesitating before pressing send. When she did, she felt no relief, only the weight of knowing words were not enough. Colin knocked on the door later, annoyance in his tone. "You really left me hanging out there. People notice when the host's wife disappears." Natalie said nothing. She turned her back, pretending to sleep. She imagined her father driving home, imagined him alone in that small house filled with echoes of her mother's laughter, and her chest ached with a guilt she could not put into words. Ellis eventually went to his workshop. The scent of wood shavings greeted him like an old friend. On the workbench sat an unfinished rocking chair, its arms curved but unpolished. He ran his hands along the grain, feeling the roughness beneath his fingertips. Margaret had always loved his chairs. She said they carried something of him in them, that his patience and steadiness lived in the wood long after he was gone from the shop. Ellis wondered what she would say now had she been at that dinner. He picked up a chisel, began to work. Each scrape of metal against wood was steady, rhythmic, a language he knew better than any spoken word. He worked until his shoulders ached, until his mind quieted, until the ember in his chest dulled just enough to let him breathe. When he finally set the chisel down, the chair looked a little closer to finished. He sat in it, testing the frame. It held steady beneath him, strong, silent like him. And as he sat in the half-finished chair, Ellis Turner whispered into the night as though to Margaret, "They may think I'm weak, but they don't know what I've built. They don't know what I still can." The ember glowed brighter. Back inside the Barnes household, silence lingered for a breath after Ellis closed the door. Then, like a tide rushing back after a momentary retreat, the room filled with noise again. At first, it was only whispers, forks shifting, wine glasses clinking, a cough somewhere at the far end of the table. Then came a laugh, high-pitched, nervous. One of Colin's colleagues broke the tension with a chuckle, the kind that begged others to join in. Soon the whole table followed. Laughter rolled like a wave, not because anyone truly found the situation funny, but because people laughed when they didn't know what else to do. "Well," said a man in a gray suit, wiping his eyes, "guess he didn't take kindly to the dishwashing joke." Another voice piped up, "Come on, Colin, you shouldn't tease the old man so hard." He looked ready to bolt, and he did. More laughter, louder this time. Colin leaned back in his chair, one arm slung lazily across the backrest, his smile stretched into something almost proud. "Don't mind him," he said. He's just sensitive. My father-in-law, God bless him, takes everything to heart, but he'll get over it. He always does." The table roared again. Natalie sat frozen, her fork untouched on her plate. Each laugh felt like a knife twisting deeper. She glanced at Colin, at the ease with which he dismissed her father's dignity, and she felt a coldness spread inside her chest. She wanted to shout, to tell them all that Ellis Turner was not just an old man, but a man who had built homes with his hands, who had carried her on his shoulders when her mother was sick, who had stayed awake through endless nights by Margaret's bedside when cancer made every breath a battle. But her voice caught in her throat. Instead, she lowered her eyes, pushing peas around her plate until they rolled like green marbles across porcelain. Ellis, meanwhile, sat in his small workshop. The rocking chair under his hands was quiet company, but his ears still echoed with the memory of that laughter, the brittle, mocking kind that burned deeper than anger. It wasn't the first time he had been underestimated. When he was 20, starting as a carpenter's apprentice, older men had laughed at his crooked cuts and uneven joints. When he was 30, people had chuckled at his modest house, asking why he didn't aim higher. Even in his 40s, when he coached Little League, parents had laughed when his team lost 3 games in a row, saying he was too soft on the kids. But this was different. Those had been laughs of strangers. Tonight's laughter had come at his expense from inside his own daughter's home. Ellis sat back, letting his head rest against the unfinished wood. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he saw Margaret again. She was younger in his memory, her hair tied back, her eyes fierce as she said, "Ellis, you don't let people treat you like that. Not in your own house, not anywhere." But this wasn't his house. That was the truth that cut deepest. At the barn's dining table, the laughter tapered into smaller conversations. Plates were cleared, the night moved on. To anyone else, it was just another dinner party, another evening of wine and casual cruelty tucked into the folds of ordinary life. But for Natalie, the sound of that laughter stayed with her long after the last guest left. When the door closed behind the final couple, she turned to Colin, her voice low but trembling. "Why did you say that?" Colin looked up from pouring himself another drink. "Say what? You know what about the dishes in front of everyone?" He shrugged, sipping casually. "It was a joke. Everyone knew it. You're being dramatic." "He's my father," she said, her voice sharper now. "And he's my father-in-law," Colin shot back. "If he can't take a joke, that's on him. You saw how uptight he was. Come on, Natalie, you can't baby him forever. The man's stuck in the past." Natalie turned away, her chest heavy. She wanted to argue, but she also knew Colin's walls, how quickly his voice could harden, how he turned every confrontation into a battlefield he had to win. So she stayed quiet for now. But in her silence, a seed of resentment grew. Back at Ellis's house, the night stretched long. He ate nothing, though he reheated some soup out of habit. He let it grow cold on the table as he sat staring out the window, watching the street lamp flicker on and off. He thought about Natalie, about how her eyes had dropped when Colin mocked him. He didn't blame her, not entirely. He knew the weight of marriage, the way loyalties shifted, sometimes painfully, between the family you were born into and the one you built. Still, the image of her bowed head, her silence, ached in him. He thought, too, of Colin. The young man's smirk, the authority in his voice. It wasn't just disrespect, it was entitlement. The belief that Ellis's years, his sacrifices, his grief, all amounted to nothing more than a chore at the end of a dinner party. Ellis clenched his hands. The calluses pressed into his palms like reminders of every nail he had hammered, every beam he had lifted. His life's work, invisible to them all. And yet, As the embers in his chest burned hotter, Ellis Turner knew one thing: he would not remain invisible forever. Natalie lay awake that night, listening to Colin's steady breathing beside her. She scrolled through her phone, opening the last message she had sent to her father. It was still unread. She typed another: "Dad, please talk to me. I need to see you tomorrow." Her thumb hovered again. Then she sent it. She lay back, staring at the ceiling. In her heart, she knew the cruel laughter of that night would not fade. It would echo until someone answered it. And deep inside her, Natalie prayed her father still had enough strength left to answer it in his own quiet way. Ellis didn't sleep much that night. Sleep had become a fragile thing for him in the years since Margaret's passing, but on this night it was even more elusive. Each time he closed his eyes, the same image replayed: the smirk on Colin's face, the ripple of laughter along the dinner table, Natalie's bowed head. He lay awake, the ceiling fan turning slowly above him, casting shadows across the room. The house felt too large, too empty, and the silence, though it had often been his comfort, pressed on him like a weight. By dawn, Ellis had made a decision. Not with grand speeches, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had carried burdens heavier than words. He would not return to that house, not as long as respect was missing there. That weekend, Natalie appeared at his doorstep. She looked tired, as though she hadn't slept either. Her hair was tied back loosely and her hands were folded together in front of her, twisting nervously. "Dad," she said softly when he opened the door. Ellis nodded, stepping aside to let her in. They sat at the kitchen table where Margaret's curtains still hung, faded from years of sunlight. The old clock ticked steadily in the corner. "I'm sorry," Natalie whispered. Her eyes glistened, and for a moment she was not 34 but 12 again, confessing some small childhood guilt. "I should have said something. I should have defended you." Ellis reached across the table, resting his rough, calloused hand over hers. "Nat," he said gently, "you don't have to apologize for me. I'm fine." But she shook her head, tears spilling now. "You're not fine. I saw your face, Dad. I've never seen you walk out like that before. It broke my heart." Ellis looked at her for a long moment. Then he gave a small smile. Sometimes walking away is the only way left to stand tall. Natalie swallowed hard. She had no reply, only the ache of knowing her father was right. 2 days later, Colin called Ellis. His voice was smooth as always, but beneath it was a thread of irritation. "You didn't have to make such a big deal the other night," Colin said. "It was just a joke. People are still talking about it." Ellis listened, saying nothing. "You embarrassed Natalie," Colin continued. "Storming out like that, it looked bad." Ellis closed his eyes, the phone pressed against his ear. He thought of answering sharply, thought of telling Colin what real embarrassment was, holding your head high while others laughed at you in your daughter's home. But instead, he let silence fill the line. Finally, Ellis said, "I don't think I'll be coming to dinner again for a while." His voice was calm, steady, the way it always was. There was a pause, then Colin scoffed. "Suit yourself." The call ended, and with it something else ended too. That Sunday, Ellis attended church alone. He sat in the same pew he and Margaret had occupied for 30 years. The hymns rose, voices mingling, but Ellis barely sang. He watched the stained glass windows glow in the morning light, their colors casting across the floor like promises no one could quite hold. After the service, old friends greeted him. Some asked about Natalie, others about his health. He smiled, answered kindly, but kept the weight of the past week locked inside. One older man, a friend from the Carpenters Guild, clapped him on the shoulder. "You're quieter than usual, Ellis. Everything all right?" Ellis only nodded, just thinking. The friend chuckled. That's dangerous at our age. But Ellis knew his thoughts weren't dangerous. They were necessary. They were shaping something inside him, something that would eventually change everything. That evening, Natalie returned again. She brought leftovers from her kitchen. Though Ellis knew Colin had not encouraged it, she set the containers on the counter, fussing with them as though arranging them just right might fix what had been broken. "Dad," she said finally, her voice low, "Colin doesn't understand. He won't apologize. He doesn't think he did anything wrong." Ellis leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. He looked at his daughter, the girl he had raised, the woman she had become, and he saw the conflict written all over her face. "You can't change him, Nat," Ellis said, "not if he doesn't see it himself." Tears brimmed again in her eyes. "But I can't lose you." "You won't," Ellis said softly. He reached out, squeezed her hand. "I may walk away from a table, but I'll never walk away from you." Natalie broke then, sobbing quietly, her head bowed. Ellis held her hand until the tears slowed. Later that night, after she left, Ellis went back to his workshop. The rocking chair sat waiting, the same one he had worked on after the disastrous dinner. He ran his hands along the wood, smoothing its edges, feeling the life in the grain. Margaret's voice came to him again, as it often did in the quiet. "Dignity isn't about what others give you, Ellis. It's about what you refuse to give away." He picked up his chisel, set it against the wood, and smiled faintly. For the first time in days, the ember in his chest burned not with shame, but with strength. Ellis Turner had walked away, and in doing so, he had found a dignity no one at that dinner table could ever take from him. The night had fallen soft and deep over the little town, pressing its quiet fingers against the rooftops. In Ellis Turner's house, the lights in most rooms were out, save for the dim lamp that glowed in his workshop. He had tried to sleep. He had lain on the couch, pulled Margaret's afghan over his chest, and closed his eyes. But the silence only summoned voices from the past, and the shadows reminded him of all that had slipped away. So, as he often did when sleep would not come, he wandered into the workshop. The rocking chair stood in the center, half complete, its curved arms catching the lamplight. Ellis touched it gently, running his hand along the smooth grain. His fingertips caught on a rough edge. He thought of how Margaret used to tease him. "You'll sand that wood until it disappears, Ellis. You want it smoother than glass." He could almost hear her laugh now, a sound that filled a room without needing to be loud. It was the kind of laugh that made life feel lighter. Ellis pulled his stool closer and sat, staring at the wood. He wasn't carving tonight. Instead, he let the memories roll over him, slow and steady like the tide. He remembered their first home, a tiny two-room cottage with thin walls and a leaky roof. Margaret had stood in the doorway on their first night, rain dripping into a bucket in the corner, and said, "We'll fix it, Ellis, together." And they had. With his hands and her stubborn cheer, they had turned that house into a home. Ellis could still recall the way she painted the kitchen walls yellow, insisting it made mornings brighter. He remembered the nights when Natalie was a baby, her cries splitting the dark. Margaret would rock her gently, whispering songs while Ellis stood nearby, rubbing his wife's shoulders. "Go back to bed," she would murmur. "You've got work at dawn." But he never did. He stayed because even exhaustion felt easier with her beside him. Then there were the hard years, the sickness. Margaret had grown pale, the laughter slower to come, but still she carried herself with a quiet dignity. "Don't you dare pity me, Ellis," she once told him, her voice firm even when her body was weak. "All I ask is you keep loving me the way you always have." He had. To the very end he had. Now, sitting alone in the workshop, Ellis felt the weight of those memories pressing down, not as sorrow but as a reminder. Margaret had lived with dignity, and she had expected the same from him. He stood and walked back into the house, into their old bedroom. The air still smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets she used to tuck into the dresser drawers. He opened the bottom drawer now, where he kept things he didn't often touch. Inside was a small wooden box he had built years ago, smooth and plain, the lid fitted snugly. He lifted it out and set it on the bed. When he opened it, he found the keepsakes of a life. Margaret's wedding ring, which she had taken off near the end when her hands had swollen. A stack of letters she had written him when they were young, tied with a faded ribbon, and photographs, edges curled, colors fading. Ellis picked up one picture, Margaret standing in the yard, her arm around Natalie when she was a little girl. The two of them smiling, sunlight in their hair. He felt his throat tighten. He whispered, "What would you say to me now, Maggie?" The room was still, but in his heart he heard her voice. "You already know the answer, Ellis. Don't let anyone take away who you are." Ellis sat on the bed for a long time, the box open beside him. His hand rested on the photo. Slowly, the ember inside him began to glow brighter, not hot with anger but steady with resolve. He realized something then, something simple yet unshakable. The respect he had lost at Colin's table was not gone forever. It was his to claim back, not by shouting, not by fighting, but by living with the dignity Margaret had believed in. And he would, not just for himself, but for the memory of the woman who had always seen his worth even when the world laughed. Outside, the night deepened. The house was quiet except for the creak of the old porch swing in the wind. Ellis turned off the light, placed the box back in the drawer, and returned to the workshop. He sat in the half-finished rocking chair, and this time, as the wood cradled him, he didn't feel small. For the first time since that cruel dinner, Ellis Turner felt strong again. And though he didn't yet know how, he knew this strength would carry him toward something more, something that would change everything. The week after the dinner felt longer than most months. Natalie moved through her days as though she were carrying a stone in her chest. At work, her colleagues asked questions she barely registered. At home, Colin brushed past her with the same easy arrogance, pouring his wine, flipping through his phone, speaking as if nothing had happened. But Natalie couldn't forget. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's face when Colin made the joke. She saw the way his hand trembled slightly around the wine glass, the way his eyes dimmed, not with rage but with something worse, disappointment. And then she saw the way he walked away, his back straight, his silence louder than any protest could have been. The image haunted her. One evening, Natalie sat alone in the living room after Colin had gone upstairs. The house was still, lit only by the lamp near the sofa. She picked up her phone, scrolled to her father's name, and stared at it for a long time. Her thumb hovered, then pressed. The call rang once, twice, then clicked to voicemail. "Dad," her voice cracked immediately. She swallowed hard. "I don't know if you'll listen to this, but I need you to know I'm sorry. I should have spoken. I should have done something. You didn't deserve that. Not from him, not from anyone. I love you, Dad. Please don't shut me out." When she hung up, the tears came fast, spilling down her cheeks in hot streams. She pressed her face into her hands and sobbed, the sound muffled in the empty room. The next morning, Natalie drove to Ellis's house. She hadn't told Colin. He wouldn't have approved. He would have called it unnecessary drama. But she couldn't keep carrying the weight alone. She parked in front of the little white house with its sagging porch, a place that smelled of her childhood, sawdust, coffee, and the faintest hint of lavender from her mother's sachets. For a moment, she just sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to gather herself. Then she stepped out. Ellis opened the door before she even knocked. It was as though he had been waiting, though his face betrayed no surprise. He simply nodded, his eyes soft, and stepped aside. They sat in the kitchen. The same kitchen where Natalie had once done homework at the table, where Margaret had once stirred soup while humming softly to herself. The clock ticked steadily in the corner, a sound that filled the silences between them. Natalie couldn't hold it in any longer. Tears spilled before she even spoke. "Dad," her voice broke. "I failed you. I sat there and I let it happen. I let them laugh at you. I let him." She stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "I didn't say anything. I should have stood up for you." Ellis reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. His palm was rough, the hand of a man who had worked his whole life, but the touch was tender. "Nat," he said quietly, "you don't have to carry this weight." "Yes, I do." Her tears fell faster now. "You've carried me my whole life. You worked yourself to the bone for me, and when it was my turn to protect you, I stayed silent. I chose him over you." Ellis shook his head. "You didn't choose Natalie. You were caught between two loyalties. That's not easy. I don't blame you. But I blame myself," she whispered. Ellis leaned back, his eyes steady on hers. "Listen to me, Nat. I walked away because I needed to. It wasn't about weakness. It was about dignity. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing a man can say." Natalie's shoulders shook. She wanted to believe him, but the guilt dug deep. "I don't want to lose you, Dad. Please don't shut me out." Ellis's expression softened. "You won't lose me, ever. I may walk away from disrespect, but I'll never walk away from my daughter." At those words, Natalie broke completely. She stood, moved around the table, and wrapped her arms around her father's shoulders. He rose slowly, holding her the way he had when she was small, letting her sob against his chest. The tears stained his shirt, but Ellis didn't mind. To him, they were a kind of baptism, washing away the guilt she carried, reminding them both of the bond no mockery could sever. Later, as the tears subsided, Natalie sat back down, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. "What will you do, Dad?" she asked quietly. Ellis looked down at his hands, scarred and strong. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he said, "I don't know yet, but I won't let this stand as the last word, not for me, not for you." Natalie studied him. She saw something in his eyes she hadn't noticed before, something steady, something resolute. It wasn't anger, it was resolve. And for the first time since that dinner, she felt a spark of hope. That night after Natalie left, Ellis returned to his workshop. He worked late into the night, the chisel biting into the wood, the sound rhythmic and certain. Each strike felt like a promise to himself, to Margaret's memory, to Natalie. He didn't know exactly what shape his decision would take, but he knew this. The ember in his chest was no longer just burning. It was beginning to spread, casting light into the shadows that had long been around him. Ellis Turner, the quiet man, the overlooked man, was preparing slowly, silently for something greater. And when the time came, no one, not even Colin Barnes, would be able to ignore him. The next morning broke gray and heavy, the kind of sky that seemed to carry its own sorrow. Ellis Turner sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. He hadn't touched it. Instead, he stared at the wooden box he had carried from the bedroom drawer, the one filled with Margaret's keepsakes. But today he had added something new beside it, a small metal key. It opened the drawer in his study, the one he had kept locked for years, not out of secrecy but out of habit. Inside were folders, envelopes, papers he had filed carefully over time. Bank statements, the deed to his house, life insurance policies, even the modest investments he had made after Margaret passed. Nothing grand by most standards, but to Ellis, it was the sum of a lifetime of work and discipline. He carried the folder to the table, spread the papers out in front of him. The sight of them brought no pride, only quiet resolve. For decades, Ellis had lived simply, saving quietly, never boasting. Colin had no idea of the value that rested in these papers. Few people did. Even Natalie only knew in fragments because Ellis had never wanted to burden her with numbers. But now, after that dinner, after that laughter, Ellis knew he needed to decide what these papers meant. He picked up the house deed first. His home, small and weathered though it was, belonged entirely to him, paid in full years ago, no mortgage, no bank looming overhead. He touched the edge of the paper and thought of how many nights he had worked late jobs just to keep that house secure, how Margaret had painted every wall with her own hands, how Natalie had learned to ride her bike on the cracked driveway out front. This house wasn't just a place. It was memory carved into wood and stone. No one, not Colin, not his colleagues, not even Natalie, would ever take it from him. Next he sorted through his savings. Modest, yes, but steady. A little over $200,000, built over decades of careful budgeting, side jobs, and living far beneath his means. He smiled faintly as he remembered clipping coupons with Margaret, saving pennies where others spent dollars. She had called him my quiet saver. 200,000 wasn't a fortune in a world of men like Colin, who measured worth in millions and status. But Ellis knew money was never about comparison. It was about what you did with it. And suddenly, he knew what he would do. That afternoon, Ellis drove to the lawyer's office in town. The building was old, brick-faded from decades of weather, with a small brass plaque that read, Henderson and Clark, Attorneys at Law. Inside, the smell of paper and ink hung in the air. Mr. Henderson, a lawyer Ellis had known since Natalie was a child, greeted him with a handshake. The man's hair was white now, his back stooped, but his eyes were sharp as ever. Ellis Turner, Henderson said warmly. Haven't seen you in a while. What brings you here? Ellis sat down, folding his hands. I need to make some changes to my will. The lawyer raised his brows but said nothing, waiting. Ellis took a slow breath. I want everything, my house, my savings, my accounts, put into a trust, not for Colin, not for Natalie either, not directly. I want it to go to a scholarship fund, in Margaret's name, for kids who can't afford to go to college. The lawyer leaned back, studying him. That's a big step, Ellis, are you sure? Ellis's eyes were steady. I've never been more sure. I want my wife's name remembered, I want her kindness to keep living, and I won't have her memory tied to disrespect. Henderson nodded slowly, then began pulling out forms. We can arrange it. As Ellis signed his name across the documents, he felt something loosen inside him. Not anger, not vengeance, but a kind of peace. His silence was no longer only endurance, it was action. When he left the lawyer's office, the sun was breaking through the gray clouds, light streaming in thin golden rays. Ellis stood on the sidewalk, the folder under his arm, and looked up. For the first time in weeks, he felt something like Margaret's presence beside him, as if she were nodding quietly in approval. That evening, Natalie stopped by again. She looked worn, her eyes red from sleeplessness. Colin hadn't come with her. She hadn't even told him where she was going. Dad, she said, sinking into a chair, I can't keep pretending everything's fine. Colin keeps laughing it off. He thinks you're overreacting. Ellis placed the folder on the table, still closed. He looked at his daughter carefully. Nat, you need to understand something. I don't intend to fight Colin with words. Men like him don't listen to words, but I do intend to make sure my life's work doesn't fall into hands that don't respect it. Natalie frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Ellis smiled faintly. "One day you'll know. For now, just remember, silence doesn't mean weakness. It means I've chosen a different way to speak." Natalie felt a chill as she looked at her father. There was something in his tone, calm, final, immovable, that told her a storm was coming. Not a storm of shouting, but of quiet, undeniable justice. Late that night, after Natalie left, Ellis returned to the workshop. He ran his hand along the nearly finished rocking chair. The wood gleamed now, polished and strong. He lowered himself into it, the chair creaking softly beneath his weight. For the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. He could already imagine Colin's face one day when the truth came to light. Ellis Turner had been mocked at a dinner table, but in his silence he had already begun carving a legacy sharper than any word, stronger than any laugh. The hidden papers were only the beginning. The weeks rolled on quietly. Colin never spoke of that dinner again. To him, the incident had faded into nothing, just one evening among many. He assumed Ellis would eventually drift back into their orbit, as quiet fathers often did, forgiving without being asked. But Ellis did not return. He kept to his home, to his workshop, to the unfinished chair that was nearly complete now. He kept to his quiet walks down the street, nodding to neighbors, carrying himself with the same dignity that had carried him through 63 years of living. Natalie visited often. Each time she came, she felt her father growing more distant from Colin's world, yet stronger in his own. There was a steadiness in him that unsettled her, like the stillness of a lake that hides great depth. She asked questions, but Ellis never revealed what he had done with the papers. He only told her, "One day you'll understand. For now, just remember your mother's name will be remembered with honor." The one day came sooner than Natalie expected. It was a crisp autumn morning when the letter arrived at the Barnes household. A plain envelope addressed to Natalie and Colin. Colin opened it with his usual impatience, expecting bills or notices. But inside was a formal letter stamped with the seal of Henderson and Clark, attorneys at law. Colin skimmed it first, then slowed. His eyes widened. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. Natalie took the letter from his hands and read. As her eyes moved over the words, her lips parted in shock. The letter explained that Ellis Turner had finalized a trust in the name of his late wife, Margaret Turner. The house, the savings, the accounts, all of it had been moved into a scholarship fund for underprivileged children. The trust was irrevocable. Nothing, no claim, no appeal could undo it. Natalie's hands trembled as she held the paper. Tears welled in her eyes, but not from sadness. They were tears of awe, of grief, of pride. Colin, on the other hand, was livid. He paced the room, cursing under his breath. He had no right, that money, that house. It should have been ours. He's lost his mind. But Natalie wasn't listening to Colin. She was seeing her father, alone at his table, quietly signing papers that would change the lives of strangers he'd never meet. She was hearing her mother's laugh, feeling the warmth of their old home, remembering the lessons she had forgotten. Respect, dignity, love that asked for nothing in return. In that moment, she realized her father had spoken louder in silence than Colin ever could with all his boasting. A week later, the local paper carried a small story. Turner Family Trust established scholarship in Margaret Turner's name to support local students. The article was brief, but it carried Ellis's name, and more importantly, Margaret's. Ellis clipped the article, placed it carefully in the wooden box alongside her letters and photographs. Then he sat in the rocking chair he had just finished, the last of the varnish dry beneath his hands. The chair creaked gently as he leaned back, and he felt Margaret's presence there as though she were rocking beside him. Natalie visited that evening. She saw the clipping, the chair, the peace on her father's face. She didn't speak at first, she only knelt beside him, resting her head on his arm. "Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with tears, "I'm proud of you. I'm so proud." Ellis stroked her hair gently, the way he had when she was little. He didn't need to reply. The silence was enough. As for Colin, he never truly understood. He continued his life as though respect could be bought, as though money meant ownership of people. But in quiet moments, when he thought of Ellis walking away from that dinner, when he read the words in the newspaper, he felt something cold and hollow twist in his chest. Because deep down he knew Ellis Turner had won, not with words, not with fists, but with the kind of dignity that no man could mock away. Ellis sat on his porch that night, the rocking chair creaking beneath him, the autumn wind stirring the leaves. He looked at the stars and whispered softly, "We did it, Maggie. Your name will live on." And I walked away with my head high. And with that, the ember inside him finally cooled, not into ash, but into a steady, glowing light that would remain for the rest of his days. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with us through this story. We hope it reminds you of the sacred value of family, of respect, and of the quiet strength that dignity can bring. May you and your loved ones always be blessed with good health, peace, and happiness. And may the bonds of family continue to guide you, even in the darkest of shadows.